She's known as the grandmother of sexploitation films, despite the fact that there wasn't a lot of sex in her films, at least most of her films. She did have sex in some of them. And with the early films that have a lot of nudity that kind of kicked off this genre, there was no sex at all because of censorship laws. So it's just mainly a lot of nudity. And it was full on nudity because they didn't want to rock the boat, a lot of these filmmakers. I think what started things off was the nudist camps movies. And I think those came out in the 30s when a lot of those exploitation films started, like Cocaine Fiends and Reefer Madness. I think there were some nudist films around that time. And for whatever reason, in the late 50s, they made a resurgence. And that's when Doris Wishman kind of jumped in on things.
Yeah, I think you could kind of get away with those nudist films because they were educational. You know, this is about the nudist camps or the nudist movement. It's kind of an educational film.
Yeah, I think there was also a Supreme Court ruling as well that it couldn't be viewed as obscene if it's part of a lifestyle as well.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
they kind of skirted around the censorship laws in a lot of different ways. And I think keeping it on the camps helped in getting past censorship and not showing like the full frontal, like it's just mainly waist up and from behind is where they kind of like say, okay, they kind of self-censored themselves in a way. So it's like, all right, we'll just go by these rules and we won't rock the boat too much. And all right, if you guys don't go too far, then we'll look the other way as well on both sides.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the Supreme Court decision is when they did then do full frontal after that, because they basically said nudity is not obscene. So you could get away with it after that point. But before the decision, I think they kind of shied away from full frontal.
Okay. I mean, I've seen a decent amount of those nudist films. I haven't seen any with full frontal.
Wow.
I guess maybe it was just Wishman and some of the others that I did see. Mainly the nudist films I've seen was released from Something Weird video. So I didn't
Yes.
notice any of the ones that I saw that had the frontal.
I don't remember which ones had it, but I do remember seeing a trailer where they kept saying the Supreme Court has ruled nudity is not obscene, and they were showing you full frontal nudity in the trailer. So that was an example of a movie that was exploiting the decision by the court. So I can't remember what that would have been, but I suspect it was later, like late 60s or maybe even very early 70s. I'm not sure.
Hmm. Okay. Interesting. So Wishman herself, I think she got into this business after her husband died. I think at very early age, like 31 or something. I think from what I read, they were separated at the time anyway. And she was kind of working in the film industry on the distribution side. So when she saw these movies were making a lot of money and they look kind of simple to make, I think she said to herself, "Well, I can do this." And she did, but barely. Uh, so the next iteration of these type of films was the nudie cuties, and I think those were categorized as the nudist films that added a little bit more genres to it and came off of the camps. And Wishman did hers inadvertently. When she went to the New York Censorship Board, she showed them, I think it's Nude on the Moon or something with the moon. This isn't a nudist camp. She's like, no, it's a nudist camp on the moon, though. Yeah. So they rejected her claim, of the fact that it was a nudist film because they weren't actually on a nudist camp, and it was more of a genre film where she was trying to do like a space movie. So I don't think it was released in New York, not initially, but other places. And movies like that, I think, is what kind of developed the genre a little bit more when people started getting off of the camps.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think her most successful nudist film before she moved on to other things was Blaze Star Goes Nudist. And I think that was 62. And Blaze Star, I guess at the time, was a stripper, or maybe she started stripping afterwards. But she had affairs with different famous people and got some notoriety from that. And I think towards the latter end of her career, that's when Doris Wishman got a hold of her and put her in it. And it was kind of like a significant name for these type of movies, which basically had like, models just desperate for money because this wasn't really anything that would push you anywhere in your career as far as any aspirations of being a legitimate actor. And that was, yeah, I think that was the most popular of our nudist films. And Nudie Cuties, the genre developed more because I think it was David Friedman that said there's only so many ways you can shoot people playing volleyball. And because with these nudist films, it was be very little plot because you had to be on a camp. So you'd have people playing volleyball, swimming, talking. A lot of the tropes was you'd have someone who didn't think that, being on a nudist farm, it's kind of like a farm. They're like animals. They're all cattled out there. But the nudist camp, I think it would be someone who would think, oh, it's wrong, or they'd be like a prude. Then they'd go on the camp either as a reporter or undercover, and they say, oh my God, this is wonderful. And then they'd be nude by the end of the movie. And that plot was in a lot of them. I don't know how much you watch, but it seemed like that was a plot to a lot of these type of films. And again, the main footage of the reason why people went there was for the nudity, and there's only so much that you can show people doing nude. And it's funny too, because a lot of these shots, as you mentioned, there were some that had full frontal nudity, but the ones I saw, when the actors were, or the models or the nudists were facing the camera, they had pants on. And then when the camera was behind them, they had no pants on, because they had to skirt around that in some way. But there was only so far I could go. And I think by like the mid 60s, early to mid 60s, it kind of phased out. It was just like maybe 4 or 5 years. And then eventually censorship laws loosened up a little bit. And that's where you got roughies.
Right. Yes. I didn't see a ton of the nudist movies, but I remember people carrying towels around. Does that sound familiar? Like they'd carry a towel and it would strategically be in front of their crotch so you couldn't really see anything.
Yes.
That's what I remember. Yeah.
Yeah, they did that too as well. Yeah, yeah. A towel, a beach ball, something would be in front of their genitalia. Convenient
right.
when the camera was facing them, if it wasn't like a close up or like a medium shot.
Yes.
But yeah, as those type of films wore themselves out, the nudist films and the nudie cuties, roughies added element of violence to it. You still couldn't show, again, with the nudist films, there was no sex. It was just nudity. With the roughies, you couldn't really do sex either. So it was a lot of sex talk. And for me, of these different sex, not sex, not sex, sex, of these type of films, this was my favorite one. It almost felt like Twilight Zone-ish, some of the plots and things like that, but they were categorized by going going black and white because these nudist films were generally in color. I think almost all roughies were black and white. They all had jazz music, and most of them had male protagonists. That's where Doris Wishman was kind of different. A lot of her films had female protagonists, but it was a lot of violence against women, and it was a lot of talking about sex when the sex was actually happening. And then when the sex was over, then we'd see a little bit of nudity and things like that. But they couldn't actually show sex. They showed the lead up to sex and a lot of sex talk. And that was my favorite part of the genre to me, is that the titles and the sex talk. I wrote down a few: wanton desires, insatiable lust, carnal passion, sex without shame, corrupt and immoral, a woman too much for man, lust was my destiny, I found my body but lost my soul. These are just, I don't know, I find these so hilarious, and they do them so dramatically as well. But yeah, to me, that's what really attracted me. Those trailers that had a few of those, a lot of that dialogue, and some of the violence and stuff like that. That's what really attracted me
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting when you hear about roughies, you hear about it both in terms of these sort of softcore films that we're talking about now, but also hardcore films. There are a lot of hardcore roughies that I guess came along later, but that's not really so much what we're talking about now. We're talking about these 1960s kind of pre-hardcore adult films.
Yeah, yeah. And I think Russ Meyer was credited with starting the Roughie because
Oh
he
yeah,
was someone that liked black and white photography. He is someone we should highlight at some point as well, but he's so incredibly talented to be working in smut. It was just ridiculous. Like you'd see some of the shot compositions in his films,
mhm.
and you compare it to the content, and it'd be like, dude, these shots look as good as like any Hollywood movie, but here's just like some woman with giant tits running around with a dildo. You know, it's his
Yeah,
desires and his carnal lust for big-breasted women was just insane because his talent was just so much better than his material. But I think
yeah,
he was the one credited with starting these type of films in the mid 60s. And like you said, these were mainly a 60s type film. And when you got into, I think 1972, that's when Deep Throat came out. Censorship
mhm,
was really relaxed, and you had hardcore porn, and it became harder for a lot of these filmmakers because they didn't necessarily. I think a lot of their appeal was just like pushing the envelope. But when there's
mhm.
like, all right, there's no envelope to push, you could just do whatever you want. There, a lot of them didn't really want to do anything. They just mainly wanted to just like see what they can get away with. But if they can get
Yeah,
away with anything, a lot of them just kind of like either faded away because they were getting older anyway, or they just didn't have a lot of interest in doing the hardcore stuff. But yeah, when Deep Throat came out, not only did you have hardcore porn, but you had like live sex shows in New York and different places like that. So the climate definitely changed with these movies.
for sure. And Russ Meyer, I think, was one of the few guys who sort of was able to continue making not hardcore films. They were kind of close, but they weren't quite hardcore because he had enough of a fan base. People really liked what he did. So they would kind of keep going to his films, even though they could have gone to a more hardcore film. And it's interesting to see Doris Wishman also continued on. She made movies long after this era kind of ended, and I think she maybe did dabble in hardcore at one point. Is that right?
Yes,
She
she did.
making
Yeah.
yeah.
So we talked about some of the nudist films she did, and we also talked about Nude on the Moon, the nudie cutie that she did. And later on, we'll be reviewing one of her roughies. She did make a lot of decent roughies. Bad Girls Go to Hell, just that title alone is just great. Um, Too Much Too Often, Another Day, Another Man. She made some really good roughies. I think that's what most people who know of her would know of her from. But you're right. As the roughies started to fade out in the 70s, you either had to come up with like really good gimmicks. You had to have a fan base, like you said, with Russ Meyer. And not just the fan base, but he was just, as I mentioned before, just a really talented filmmaker. So even though the content was a little bit not as edgy as others, his execution was so much better than everyone else. I mean, you
Yeah,
compare the look of a Russ Meyer film with the look of any other like sex film in that era, hardcore or not, he was just so much more elevated than the rest of them. So yeah, so with Doris Wishman, I think she kind of held off on doing the hardcore, and she really went into the gimmicky type stuff. And she found her biggest success, and I use that word intentionally.
yeah,
Deadly Weapons, where I think the woman that was a star in it, her breast measured like 73 inches or something like that. Like the
yes, Chesty Morgan.
yeah.
Yeah,
I think she was a stripper who had a similar background to Doris in that she was very tiny and her husband died at an early age. But instead of getting into film, she got into stripping and then eventually hooked up with Doris. And then I think they were supposed to do a three-picture deal, but they never got along.
mhm,
Chesty was kind of being a little bit of a diva, and Doris had her way, so they kind of clashed a lot. Instead of doing the three movies, they did do the one, which I think was her biggest movie, biggest since Blaze Stargo's Nudist, and I think her biggest movie, period. I don't know if she made the most money from it because she sold the rights. She eventually got them back in time for home video when that became a thing in the 80s. But she did the one, and Double Agent 73, I think, was a sequel, but it was mainly a lot of like
Yes.
takes and stuff like that. I don't know if they actually went out and shot stuff. So there's just a bunch of footage that she had laying around. And the third one they were supposed to do, they killed off her character when the movie started. So it was
Mm.
just somebody laying under a sheet. Was supposed to be her, and that was the extent of her participation in what would have been the third movie they would have done together.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I didn't know about the third movie, but the first two I do know quite well. And I heard that she didn't really want to do the second one, but then she thought of the idea that Chesty Morgan would have a camera implanted in one of her breasts. And she thought that was such a great idea, she had to make the movie. That's what I heard.
That is such a terrible idea. Because all she would do is pull up her breast, and then you would hear a camera clicking. Like, where's the camera? Where's the flash? Like, none of
It's the
it makes.
power of imagination. You gotta imagine that the
Yeah.
camera's there.
Yeah, so and then I think another one of her gimmicks, she did some transgender stuff. We did talk about a movie that Ed Wood did when we did him, Glenn or Glenda. And I think a little bit around that time, a little bit after, Doris did one as well. I think Glenn or Glenda was late 60s and Doris did one in 71, but she didn't complete it and release it till later on in the 70s. But she was looking for gimmicks, and when the gimmicks didn't work, like you said, she ended up caving in and she did some hardcore porn. I think she did two or three. She denied it for a very long time, but later on in her life, when something weird started releasing all these movies, it's pretty easy to tell what a Doris Wishman film is, and it was obvious that those were the couple of the films that they found were Doris Wishman films. Satan Was a Lady and Come With Me, My Love, I think, were the two hardcore ones that she did.
Like Russ Meyer, she has a recognizable style.
Yes.
You can't mistake her style.
No, you can't. And you can't. You could imitate it, but I don't think you'd want to. Later on, I think she tried to dabble in slasher films in the late 70s, early 80s when that became a thing. And Night to Dismember was her slasher film. I don't know what happened because the stories are kind of convoluted, but I think the people who invested in the film, so it was kind of their film, and she was just shooting it. They saw the footage, and I think they were freaked out at how bad it was. I don't know if they didn't realize that she wasn't a very good filmmaker, and I think they didn't want it released. And she had just the outtakes and the takes she wasn't going to use. What Doris Wishman chooses to put in front of the camera, you can only imagine what she thinks isn't good enough to use. And she's one of these filmmakers like Ed Wood who shot one for one, where they basically use almost everything that they shot. But the footage that she wasn't going to use, she basically patched together, tried to call back some of the actors, and then released it that way. It's not a film I've seen. It's not a film I want to see. But she was able to release it. I did listen to the audio commentary on it though, just so I can get more interviews and more background and more stories about Doris. So I did hear the audio commentary, but I haven't watched the film.
I don't think I've seen that one either.
Yeah, so that was like the early 80s. And then I think she kind of retired for a while, went to Florida, worked in like a sex shop or something like that. And, with the release of her films on DVDs and Something Weird and things like that, she started to have a little bit of a following again. And then she, I think, made a couple of appearances on the Conan O'Brien Late Show, and that led to her doing a couple of more movies before she died. I think she got terminal cancer and ended up dying of pneumonia or something like that. But I think she lived till like 90 or something like so. She lived a really long and interesting life. But yeah, not a very good filmmaker. Obviously, we're talking about her not to rag on her. For some reason, myself and maybe you, I don't know, I haven't asked you, I hate for you to say you don't find her films endearing, because then I force you to watch one of her films. But there's something a little bit endearing about her. I know that there's a lot of feminists that try to recontextualize her films, being a female director in that type of just in industry at all. Prolific female director based on output, a male dominated genre or subgenres, and the fact that she had female protagonists in her films. A lot of feminists recontextualize her films and say she's a, pioneer and feminist in the feminist movement, and she completely denies it. She runs from it. She's like, no, like I think the way she does it, she speaks about it, she's oblivious to being a woman. She just was a person doing what she did, and she didn't have a lot of self-awareness of her place and how people maybe treated her differently, or she was just around such a small circle of people. She didn't have she had a cameraman, clearly never had a sound guy. She never recorded sound. She had her cameraman and a couple of models, and that was it. So her circle could be so small that she kind of was shielded from it, and the people around her treated her well, or she was just so oblivious to people treating her differently. But to her, being a woman never factored in her career in any kind of a way at all.
Yeah, well, I do find her films endearing. I do enjoy watching her films, and I think just by the virtue of the fact that she was a woman and she was producing, directing, writing these films, I think in a way that is kind of a feminist thing. She's kind of ahead of the curve. She was a pioneer, whether she intended to be or not, and whether she had any political ideas about it, it doesn't matter. I think just because she was doing it, she was important in that way.
Absolutely. So we kind of talked about her filmography, the evolution of these sex films. I want to get a little bit into her directing style and what makes her films unique, because we did say, like, with the porn, you can recognize a Wishman film. I mean, 2 minutes in, you're watching a Wishman film. Some of the
Yes.
characteristics is pretty much do it yourself type filmmaker, guerrilla filmmaker. Her voiceovers are very jarring. It's her and a couple of her friends. She claims they were professionals, but it's just the same 3 or 4 people that did all the voices in all of her movies. It all sounded like middle-aged men, Wishman, and maybe a couple of other girls that would rotate with these voices. But the voiceovers were always jarring because they didn't seem like they fit with the characters. She always shot in her apartment. She tried to make her apartment look as different as possible, different exteriors, different corners of different rooms. But most of her films were shot in and around her apartment. Another characteristic is a lot of out of focus shots. Focus wasn't part of, you can use focus as a double entendre. She wasn't very focused. Her shots wasn't very focused. Her decor was very tacky. She was a single Jewish woman living in New York. I don't think she was necessarily trendy in any type of a way. So I don't know if she was necessarily looking to have a nice aesthetics around her apartment. So because her apartment wasn't very aesthetic, her films weren't very aesthetic. I think we kind of joked, or I did at least, when we reviewed Paranormal Activity, that the filmmaker spent 90% of the budget renovating his house because he was shooting the film in his house. And I kind of mocked him for that. I'm like, yeah, you're just writing off your renovations for like a zero budget movie that you're shooting in your house. Well, I think Doris Wishman could have took his advice, even though he came out way after her. I mean, he was probably even born when she was doing some of these movies, but yeah, she probably should have spent some of her money renovating her apartment or her house or whatever and wrote that off, because visually it hurt her films. There weren't a lot of exterior shots. It was just an ugly apartment with very tacky things, and she would cut away to those things so often that you couldn't not notice them. Speaking of cutting away to things, she never recorded audio live. When people were talking, you either saw the back of their head, you saw the phone covering their mouth so you couldn't see their lips, or you saw the person they were talking to. So if I'm talking, it'd be a shot of you, and you're talking, it'd be a shot of me. So she'd use tactics like that because she didn't record audio live. And also, from this is what I found out from her an interview with an autobiographer, is that she directed after she said action. So she would say action. Let's say it's a scene going on. She'd say, okay, now you walk over there. Now you stand there. And she'd be saying this as the take was going on. So it made sense because she never bothered with audio anyway. So she could direct these actors as the scene was going on. So she directed during the scenes themselves. She always had female protagonists or mostly female protagonists. Multiple characters had voiceovers because obviously not recording audio, it helps if a lot of people had voiceovers, so that would get a lot of the dialogue out. She shot oftentimes without a script. Sometimes she would figure out what people were saying or where the plot was going as she was editing it and doing the voiceover. I think those were a lot of the major stuff. Also, while people were talking, I think we already mentioned she'd cut away to feet, hands, and the different objects in her room. And I remember that was super jarring for me the first time I saw one of her films because I'd see two people talking and then I'd see a shot of a tree, like a a fake tree in the corner of a room, and then when they stopped talking, we'd see the actors again. Then when they started talking, I'd see a shot of their foot, and then when they stopped talking, it was so jarring. And I think that's again one of the huge characteristics that you can find with her films. Anything I left out?
Well, I don't know her films as well as you do, but just based on my recent viewing here, I noticed she liked to use mirrors in a lot of shots. Do you think that's something she did in a lot of films? Or
Yeah, I would say she used mirrors a decent amount. Well, I mean, when you're in an apartment shooting all those movies, there's only so much freedom and so many things you can do. So anything she could do that was a little bit creative within the confines of an apartment, she kind of did. I don't think
I
that
thought,
if she did the mirror thing, I don't think it was as much as the things I mentioned, but I'm sure she probably did it multiple times.
no, I thought she made good use of it. And you know what you're saying about the recording with no sound, and that's a fairly common technique. You know, certain films where you don't record sound, and so yeah, you're always looking at the person who isn't talking. You know, it's very unusual. But I did notice that she kind of made that she had some moments. She made an effort to actually show people starting to speak, and so it kind of helped create the illusion that, oh yeah, this person's talking, and then she would kind of go to the back of the head or the other person, and or the foot or whatever it was. But I felt that there were at least moments where she made an effort to kind of show the lips moving, and I appreciated that.
So it doesn't sound like we're speaking that, glowingly about Doris. I mean, she wasn't a very good filmmaker. She didn't put a ton of effort into her films, but she was able to get films done. So why are we talking about her? Why are we highlighting her? For me, it's because when I started really investing in films, immediately Stanley Kubrick, Orson Welles, Akira Kurosawa, some of these filmmakers, and I can keep going on. I immediately thought, man, these films and these filmmakers and what they're doing is just so amazing. But none of that applied to me. I wasn't trained. I have no resources. I have some of the worst actors you can get. It's just people moonlighting as actors. So as much as I love those type of filmmakers and the films they made, I couldn't make those films. I had like 50 cents in my pocket. I had a camera I borrowed from a friend of mine and he'd help me shoot it. And it was just the two of us. We'd put out an ad, we'd get actors who were willing to work for free, who weren't union. And again, we're talking about bartenders and waitresses and people living at home with their parents. And it's like, hey, let's make a movie. And immediately what you realize is they don't take it serious. They don't memorize their lines. Sometimes they don't show up. They'll show up once and they won't show up again. So you have to constantly adjust. You have to have it in your mind that this person, if they show up today, if I don't get everything done with them today, I may not see them tomorrow and I may not have a movie I can finish. So while I do say certain things a little set that may sound a little snarky about Doris, I applied 90% of the things we talked about to help me get my movies finished. There was a scene in Hookers in Revolt, a movie I shot, where the actor didn't know his lines. I just had him put the cell phone up to his mouth so we couldn't see his lips. And I just said, dude, just ad lib as long as you want. I will cut up your scene. And when when you're talking, we'll just go in the other room, we'll record your audio and I'll play that audio and then we'll do it that way. There was another scene we had where a girl couldn't remember her lines. I was like, fine, I will hold the script up to your face. We'll have the camera right there, and you will just read your lines. And it'll be a close up so they can't see the script. Or I've had times where it's like, all right, you know what? Have the shot on me. I'll talk. And, when it's your time to talk, the camera will stay on me and it'll mainly be on me. And then we'll maybe have the back of your head. And so all I can keep going on, but all of these things I talked about, I apply to different movies I did. And I even did a tribute trailer, a Ruffy style trailer where it's like wanton desires and carnal lust for one of my movies as well. And I used like the title for her movies as taglines for mine's. Lust for Vengeance, the tagline was Bad Girls Go to Hell. And in Hookers and Revolts, one of the hookers say, Another Day, Another Man. So I pay huge homage to her in my films, and I've learned how to get films done by watching her films, because when you have such few resources, the goal isn't making a good film. The goal is making a film. And the one thing about Doris is she made a lot of films. You can say whatever you want about her films. There's a lot of filmmakers that call themselves filmmakers that have one or two films or just have a bunch of unfinished films. Doris Wishman, she died at 90 with a huge filmography.
True. When you write your autobiography, you can call it Everything I Know About Filmmaking I Learned from Doris Wishman.
You know what? Maybe I should. Maybe I should.
Why not?
Any final thoughts on Doris as a filmmaker or her filmography or the sex fiction genre?
I enjoyed Doris. I enjoy her films. I guess, as I've sometimes said, I have a high tolerance for films that a lot of people just can't watch or they just think are terrible. But I see something in these films. They're like a time capsule in a way. They're a window into a place and a time. And her style is interesting. I love the music. Actually love a lot of the photography. The black and white photography. There's some interesting shots. I just enjoy these movies. I don't know why exactly, but they appeal to me.
What would you say is your favorite Wishman film?
Well, I would probably have to go with either Deadly Weapons or Double Agent 73. Those are the two that I really know the best, and I find them irresistible.
Yeah, those are her more popular films. I just never got into them. I didn't find that Busty Morgan. I never found her attractive. I don't know. I had a friend like that, which just she's giant tits, and I dated her for a few months, and once you get over the giant tits, it's they just kind of they're kind of intrusive, and you kind of see like how encompassing it is to these women, because she couldn't really exercise, she couldn't do a lot of stuff because her tits were just so big.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people have commented that Chesty Morgan isn't really that attractive, and I think she kind of, if it wasn't for the huge breasts, she probably wouldn't have had a career as a stripper. That it was a gimmick, right? It was a total gimmick. And even the breasts, some people have commented that they don't really look that good. They're huge, but they're not necessarily beautiful. I don't know that I'm going to go that far, but I can see that she's not necessarily everybody's dream girl.
Judging her attractiveness is just that, that was the appeal of the movie,
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Not singling out her because of her looks, but that was the appeal of the movie. Is, oh my God, this sexy, gorgeous, big-breasted woman. If you're not into that, then it's just a woman with big tits just like sitting on a couch for 90% of the movie.
Yeah, I remember reading the description of Deadly Weapons, and it said something like she murders men with her breasts, or she kills men with her breasts. And I thought, oh man, this is going to be amazing. I had visions of how she was going to use her breasts as weapons, but it's pretty tame, though. She just kind of smothers them. She doesn't really.
Yeah, I
She,
think
she
part of that was the actress herself, Busty Morgan, is she didn't want to do much. She wanted people out of the room when she did nude scenes. She'd show up late. She, was very difficult to work with. And also, Wishman isn't that creative to make her do a bunch of other things, even if she wanted to. So even though the premise is interesting, the execution wasn't very good, even if you were into it. They didn't really, like you said, they didn't really do a lot of creative things. And it was kind of disappointing.
yeah, fair enough.
I'm a huge fan of Doris Wishman. I'm a huge fan of Roughies. So when decided we were gonna review a Wishman movie, it had to be a Roughie for me. And I like a lot of them. The reason I specifically picked this one, My Brother's Wife, is because I did a movie in the early 2000s called, is it early 2000 or early 2010s? Early 2010s, called Scumbag Hustler. And it's about a crackhead who runs around the city pulling scams, having sex with different women. And it was basically shot guerrilla style. It was myself and my cinematographer. He had the camera. I was directing and I was acting as the lead. We'd cycle around the city. We were both on our bikes, and we'd stop at different parts of the city, and we'd shoot scenes. When it was us by ourselves, we would just go to places that looked aesthetically nice, and I'd pretend to do crack, and we just shoot a bunch of scenes of me doing drugs. And then when it was time to pull scams, we would have some actors meet us at certain locations, and we would just shoot on the streets in public, and I would pull scams on them. Now, I'm shooting guerrilla style, do it yourself films, no money at all, no budget. And at this point, we had done a lot of movies together, and he was about to have some kids and he was about to stop shooting. So it was this and Ace Jackson is a Dead Man. We said we're going to do two films. We're going to learn from our mistakes. We're not going to try to make a great film. We're just going to try to make a film we can finish. Who does that remind you of? Doris Wishman. To make a film you can finish. So it wasn't going to be scripted. And we had decided, like, listen, I'm a good actor at this point. I'm not great, but I'm a good enough actor at this point, and I'm a good enough director at this point. So instead of trying to get some actors, try to make them learn lines, try to get a good performance out of them, try and hope that they show up to rehearsals, try and hope that they show up to the shoot, just get them to show up once. No audition, no rehearsal, no lines. You show up, I will act in the scene, and through my acting, I'll direct you through the scene. If you get lost, just follow my lead. So it was just kind of like a dance. Me and these actors is like, listen, just follow my lead. If you get lost, I'll guide you through it. And that's pretty much how we shot it. We shot a bunch of different scenes with actors like that. And it came to a point where we got a bunch of drug scenes, we got a bunch of scam scenes, and this was also an erotic film, which is again why we shot a bunch of sex scenes as well. And it was all with actors that showed up once. It was like, hey, here's $200 for nude models. You want to show up and do an erotic scene? Fine. Here, there's no pay, but you get an IMDb credit if you're an actor. Just show up. Don't worry about learning lines. Just show up to this location. We'll shoot it on the street. Fine. And then it's just me and him biking around. We see good locations that look visually nice. We just stop there. I pretend I'm doing crack. Fine. The only problem is nothing's connecting these scenes. It's just a bunch of scenes that with no connective tissue at all. And since there was so much borrowing of Wishman's technique, it was like, hey, we should just find a plot that from a Wishman movie, and it became My Brother's Wife. So it was like, hey, let's get two actors that we've worked with in the past that we know can learn lines, and we'll script this part of the movie. And in between, we'll cut in scenes of me doing drugs and having sex, and we'll figure out different reasons for me to be doing those stuff in the scripted part. So it's just like, all right, scripted scene, an excuse for me to go off and do drugs, another scripted scene, and it would intercut that way. As crazy as it sounds, it was my best reviewed film I've ever done. Critics loved it, fans loved it. It was a fan favorite. It only made a decent amount of money, but I'm happy at least it satisfied like my hardcore fans. We ended up going with my brother's wife because it was this sleazy character, comes in from out of town, mooches off of his brother, does a bunch of stuff behind his back, tries to have sex with his wife, and just all those different tropes. And I don't know how familiar you are with Tyler Perry because he's more of like a black culture type thing, American type thing. But he's this guy that does a bunch of black movies, a bunch of gospel type movies, and then he puts on drag and he's like, "Hey, I'm a deer," and he acts like a woman, like a big fat black woman. And for me, I hate that stuff. Culturally, it does nothing for me. I'm not African, I'm not American, I'm Caribbean. Obviously, I'm black, so it's like, it's part of my culture from that aspect of it. But that like coonery and buffoonery does nothing for me. So
Mhm.
when we did this, I named my brother Tyler P for Tyler Perry and just changed the last name. And we had him be a super religious guy that didn't want to have sex with women. And we just put some few jokes in his dialogue that he's this closeted homosexual. But yeah, he didn't want to touch women. He's like, sex is only for having babies, and we're not having babies, so I'm not gonna have sex with you. And of course, the wife character is attracted to my character because I'm all about like having a wild time, which is a lot of what the plot of my brother's wife is. And at the time, I didn't rewatch my brother's wife. I just remember the general outline of it. And here he is trying to really get with this other woman, getting money and insurance, and the wife dies. So all of those plot points are in the movie. So when it was like time to do this, I'm like, we got to do my brother's wife. So that's how we landed on this movie.
Okay, interesting. Um, I believe I did see this movie years ago, but I couldn't really remember anything about it. So it was good to see it again now. Um, it starts with this great credit scene with great music and a lot of still, sort of sexy black and white still photos. And that may have just been a cheap way of creating a sequence, just use still photos. But I think it actually kind of worked as setting up the feel of the movie. I kind of like that. And the opening scene, you see some shots of the city, and then you see a bald guy in a suit walking down the street like he means business. And it seems kind of effective. It kind of grabs you, but then it just goes on too long. It's like he just keeps on walking and walking through the street, and you're kind of like, what the hell, man? I get it. He's walking down the street. So finally, he shows up. We see a sign that says billiards, and he looks through the door, and he might be crying. I actually wasn't sure whether he was crying or sweating, but he might be crying as he looks through the door. And there's a bunch of guys playing pool inside there, and he goes in and he attacks a younger guy. And this is where you first hear dialogue, and it does sound bad. Like it sounds very artificial, not recorded on the scene as we know it wasn't. And he says something like, Mary, you killed her. And this fight breaks out. And it's just, it almost seems to rival the epic put on the glasses fight scene from John Carpenter's They Live, which goes on for about 5.5 minutes, I think, in They Live. This one, it just keeps going, and much like the walking scene, it just goes on a little too long. It just keeps on going. I was kind of shocked to take a look at it after and see it was only 2 minutes. It wasn't 5.5, but it felt like 5.5 minutes. It just kind of went on and on. And then finally, the bald guy, kind of gets the better of the young guy, and he says, if you ever come near my house again, I kill you. I'll kill you. I swear it. And he leaves. and the young man slowly recovers, and the camera kind of shakes around, which I thought was kind of cool. It's kind of a low budget kind of technique. And then we finally get those kind of wavy lines that they like to use to sort of signify that we're now flashing back, and we're going to the beginning of the story where it all started. So I thought that was kind of a good opening sequence, kind of set things up. It's like, hey, what happened here? What's going on? This guy killed Mary. Who's Mary? What's going on? So, I thought that was, aside from the fact that, things went on a bit too long, I thought that was actually kind of intriguing. And then we see the young guy in an apartment hallway, and the sort of fun music comes back. The fun music had kind of not been there during this fight sequence, but the kind of cool, fun music comes back, and I really like that. I like the music in this. So then, he knocks on a door, and this woman answers the door, and we get the voiceover line. The first time I saw Mary, I knew there had to be trouble. And again, I thought this was kind of brilliant, in a kind of a campy way. And then, we find out that this is Frankie, and he's Bob's brother, and this is Mary. She's Bob's wife. And, right away, he's sort of saying he wants to take her in his arms. And, I found that kind of strange because there's no slow burn buildup, of sexual tension. There's no sort of falling in love gradually. There's nothing. He's already getting ideas the first time he sees her. And they sit on the couch talking, and this is where, I first noticed that you could see, their lips were moving with the sound. And I was kind of impressed because I was used to, like in the fight scene, when he says that thing about if you ever come around my house, like, I don't think his lips are even moving there. I think we can kind of see this line just comes out of nowhere as he's kind of walking off. But here the lips were kind of going with it, and I thought, oh, interesting, like she actually synced it up. But anyway, again, on the couch here, he's saying things like, if Bob had told me about you, I would have been here sooner. Bob, he did all right. You're quite the dish, and he's kind of hitting on her already. And she kind of goes to the kitchen and has this internal monologue. And I thought that that's where it works kind of the best, like this artificial dialogue. It sounds better as the monologue that's in the head of the characters, not when it's supposedly the talking, because it sounds really phony when they're talking. But as an internal monologue, it kind of works. And she kind of says that, she sort of thinks that Frankie's exciting. She thinks he's more exciting than her husband, which I find very strange because, they haven't really talked about anything. He's just kind of said a few inappropriate things to her. So, I would have to say the script is underdeveloped, I guess, is what I'm saying here. It doesn't do a good job of developing this relationship or the attraction that they feel for each other. There could have been, they could have had a conversation where he said, oh, here's the things I've done, here's my life, here's how I live. And she could have thought, oh, interesting, this guy has an exciting life. But no, she just kind of decides that he's exciting for some reason. And she also says something about Bob letting his life pass by, but we don't even know anything about Bob, and she doesn't take the time to explain, oh, he's got a dead-end job, he's got boring hobbies, whatever it is, we don't know. She just it's all kind of cryptic, but then of course Bob comes home and they all sit down together, and Bob mentions that he ran into an old friend of Frankie's, this woman Zena, who's interested in Frankie, and he kind of seems to be interested in her as well. But this is something else, is that there's kind of jarring moments, where uh, he mentions this Xena, and Frankie starts to say, "Oh yeah, Xena, yeah, we had some good times together." And then Bob suddenly cuts him off and says, "What about food, Mary?" And he kind of changes the subject, and it feels very, I don't know, not quite natural the way that kind of cuts away. And also when he says that you know Frankie should get married. Being married's a good thing. I didn't used to think that I wanted to get married either, but hey, if anything happened to Mary, why? And then he kind of shifts instantly and says, "Look, kid, why don't you stay in town?" It's just like he's in the middle of a sentence and he kind of changes what he's saying. It's very, very jarring. It doesn't kind of feel natural. But anyway, um, this is all to say it's very, very interesting, and a lot of this stuff I find amusing. Like I found myself laughing in some of these moments, like where he says, "What about food, Mary?" It's just like it sort of comes out of nowhere, and it made me laugh. But yeah, I mean, I could say so much more about it here. But again, when Frankie they give him a room to stay in, and Mary finds a gun in his suitcase when she's going to help him unpack, and she finds a gun in there. And so this is where I feel like Doris Wishman is showing her technique, her sort of Chekhov kind of technique here, where Chekhov used to say, if you're going to have a gun on the wall at the beginning of a play, it better go off before the end of the play. And so here they've shown us a gun in the first 15 minutes of the movie, and my God, it is going to go off by the end of the movie. So she's showing her skill at structuring this. Um, but he then sort of has an internal monologue, and he talks about how he's going to spend a couple of weeks here, and it's going to be like a vacation. He'll get good food and all this other stuff, and with a little luck, some loving on the side. If he can convince Mary that she didn't start living until she met me, and that shouldn't be too hard. She looks bored. So, but and then he says, so Xena's still in town now. There's a girl. She's got everything and a little bit more, the kind of dame a fella never forgets. So on the one hand, he's saying, "Ooh, I'm really interested in Mary, and I'm going to hopefully have some loving on the side." But hey, wait a minute, Xena, I'm going to get with Xena. What's going on here? He's got two different women that he seems to be equally interested in. Does he already know that he's not really interested in Mary and he's just using her? Or is that an idea that comes along later? I don't know. But one thing's for sure, he's not a very sympathetic guy. It's in the first 15 minutes here. He's clearly not really the hero of the story. And then we meet Xena, and she's having kind of a wild party, almost like a pseudo orgy, except everybody's in clothes. And Frankie shows up, and they have a bit of an argument, and they eventually kind of get it on, still wearing clothes. And this is, I found myself thinking it's all strangely chaste for an exploitation film or a sexploitation film. There hasn't even been any nudity in it. Just people kind of getting it on a little bit with their clothes on. And finally, at 24 minutes into the movie, Mary takes her top off, and we get some nudity. And I suppose you could say it's like a slow burn tease, that Doris Wishman is kind of making us wait to see the nudity. And maybe that's a good idea. I don't know. But shortly after that, we get the scene where Mary, after doing the nudity, she puts on this sexy negligee, and she's sort of trying to get Bob interested in her, but he seems like he's completely disinterested, like you were saying about your version of it. I find it hard to believe how disinterested he is in her, because they're not they're not a couple that's been together for 20 years or something. They got married within the last 2 years. So it seems very odd to me that he's so disinterested. Uh, and then she says things like, "Where must I go for love? Where? Don't you understand that I want to be loved?" And he says, "I can't understand you. Maybe you'd better see Dr. Brown tomorrow." This is all gold. This is all cinema gold here, as far as I'm concerned. Um, so this is a clunky way of justifying the affair that she's going to have, because where can she go for love? She's obviously going to have to go to Bob's brother. Uh, Bob is essentially driving her into the arms of Frankie. Anyway, I found also it's an interesting story because it's almost like shades of All About Eve, in the sense that you've got, he winds up kind of using Mary. He's basically trying to manipulate her into taking out all the money that they have in their bank account, and he's lying to her. He's, we're going to go to Mexico, we're going to get married, but he needs that money, otherwise he won't be able to do that. And she's kind of in love with him, and she wants to stay with him, so she's going to maybe do that. But meanwhile, he seems to be really in love with Xena, and she's kind of saying the same thing. It's like, well, without money, you don't have Xena. You gotta get that $2,000. So it's kind of like she's playing him the same way that he's playing Mary. And then, of course, there's this cousin, Della, who shows up and is wearing leather, and there's leather gloves, and I don't know, is this some sort of a code here? Some sort of code for lesbians or something in the 60s? But something's going on there. Anyway, I don't know. I could go on and on and on about this, but basically, I found all this stuff very. It's kind of bad, but it's kind of good bad. Like, I kind of like it. It's making me laugh. I found it very entertaining. Mm-hmm. And I probably just talked way too much about it. But what do you think about any of this stuff?
No, I was amused by your summation. Just because I'm so familiar with Doris Wishman's filmography, it's just interesting to hear someone else's perspective on it. For me, I don't find her movies to be good bad. I find them to be bad. And to me, what fascinates me about her movies is thinking about what's happening behind the scenes while I watch her movies. Just thinking about like how it's being made, and that's what fascinates me. It's just like knowing that like the reason I'm seeing this tree is because they didn't record dialogue. Yeah. The reason this is going on so long is because they didn't know where it was going. Or me trying to imagine like what she's yelling at these actors in the middle of this scene. So to me, the machinations of it is what it's almost like watching a car crash for me. That's what I'm fascinated about. I don't find it good bad. The only parts that I think were entertaining on the screen, the opening was really good. You're right. It could have been tight. It could have been a couple minutes shorter, that whole opening sequence. But from that walk until he goes into that apartment and talks about like how he wants his brother's wife, all that was good. I mean, it could have been tightened up a lot. It could have been shortened up a lot. But the movie started off great with him marching like he's this overweight middle-aged man. Like, who's like, what's got him pissed? Where is he going? There's so many questions in your mind when you see him doing that march. And you're right. Is he sweating? Is he crying? Is the actor just tired? Because it's like, that walk to me was one of the best parts of the film. Just like his determination in his face.
Yes.
And the fight, and then into the flashback, and him immediately saying, "What a sleazeball!" Like the minute he walks in, "Oh, I'm gonna fuck my brother's wife."
Yeah.
What a piece of shit.
Yeah.
So to me, that whole opening sequence was fun. And I love that scene where he turns down his wife. I thought there was an interesting camera angle too, because they swooped the camera over the ceiling, back and forth, I think like twice. So it was one of the rare times where it was like artistically, it looked pretty cool. The cinematography and the fact that she's like, I want you, just like ravage me. It's like, I'm so young. I need you. I need you inside me. She's begging him for sex, and he's like, maybe we ought to take you to the doctor.
Yeah, yeah.
Like,
There's something wrong with you.
watch that and not laugh out loud,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's hilarious.
It was great. It was great. But those were the only two highlights for me. Otherwise, it was I kept thinking about like why I kept thinking about you. I'm like, man, he probably hates me. Like I make him watch this movie. It's like it's going nowhere. Because when you surmise it, when you talk about what happens, it's like this is an interesting movie. It's an interesting concept. That's why I wanted to take it for my movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't seen this movie in a long time. I shot, I forget when exactly I shot Scumbag Hustler, but it was a long time ago. And prior to shooting it, it was a long time before I saw My Brother's Wife. So I shot My Brother's Wife a really long time ago. I probably saw it a couple times within like a year or two. A long, long time ago. Haven't seen it since until we watched it for this review. In my mind, I remembered all the bullet points. I remember the fight and him rejecting his wife. I remembered like the plot outline, but I didn't remember the movie itself. But when you only remember the bullet points, it all sounds interesting. This sleazeball guy comes in, bangs his brother's wife, gets a bunch of money just to give it to some other whore that wants to run off with the money. Now he's left broke. The wife is all distraught. She already ruined her marriage and she kills her. It all sounds so salacious. It's just the execution is just not very good. And I think that's Doris Wishman in a nutshell. The way she does her movies is she comes up with a great title, a great premise, and then she basically just makes it up on the spot from there, and it's a little bit more planning and foresight and detail, and this could have been really good. But as it is, despite a lot of good things I'm saying about it, it's still, even just at an hour, it's a tough watch even at an hour.
It does feel longer than an hour, and like I said,
It feels like three. It feels like 3 hours.
That 2-minute fight scene seemed longer than 2 minutes, but I have to say though, at the very end of the movie here, we get the wavy lines, and we go back to the present where he's been beaten up in the pool hall, Frankie, and he sort of sits up and he says, "I suppose I should have kept away from her. She was my brother's wife." And that's how the movie ends. And I thought that was brilliant. It's a brilliant ending, and using the title of the film, which, I'm kind of obsessed with when they use the title of the film.
The Cat and the Canary.
So I thought that was a great ending. And actually, before that, when Bob overhears his wife talking to Frankie and they're kind of declaring love, he doesn't confront them. He kind of walks out and he says, "She's so young. She cried out for love, and I didn't listen." And I thought, again, this is kind of brilliant. And he actually says she can take the money. Without her, I don't need it. So he's actually going to let her go, and he's going to let her take the money. He's kind of a good guy, right? But he disappears for a lot of the film. After that opening 15, 20 minutes, we don't see him for a long time. And then he kind of shows up just in time to overhear that stuff. But there's an example of a relationship that could have been developed a little more or something. And I found it interesting too that even though we're a little bit past the Hays Code at this point when this film came out, but still there was a strong sense of, crime needs to be punished and this sort of thing. And Frankie kind of gets off pretty lightly for everything he's done. He's betrayed his brother. He's tried to steal his brother's life savings. He's had sex with his brother's wife. He's really caused the death of his brother's wife, but he just gets a beating. And that's it, right? The movie kind of ends. Like there isn't a sense of him really paying for all this in a way. Just a beating in a pool hall seems like a light sentence for him.
Mhm.
What did you think about that?
Well, I mean, that's the nature of roughies. That's kind of why I like them, is they're darker in tone.
Hmm.
So I think it's more realistic in that sense, in that there isn't always that happy ending.
Yeah,
But I think that's the appeal of roughies, is that,
yeah.
you know, I mean, I forgot which roughie I saw, but there was a roughie where a woman essentially gets, she's a prude throughout the whole movie. She gets raped, and the happy ending is her being raped. You know, she got what she deserved. You know,
I thought you were going to say she learns that she likes sex, which is the happy ending, but no, she gets punished. So,
there's actually a Wishman movie like that. I think it's Bad Girls Go to Hell, which is
oh
one
yeah,
we could have done as well. But again, I the reason, the Scumbag Hustler is the reason why I wanted to do this one in particular. And it would have, Bad Girls Go to Hell would have been just like this, a great premise, and it would have been a tough watch either way.
yeah.
But Bad Girls Go to Hell was another movie from Wishman that I liked, and it's one of the movies that feminists gravitate to the most, because you have this woman, again, a woman as the lead character in a roughie, is a Wishman trademark, but she wants sex from her husband and he rejects her, and then she proceeds to get raped and assaulted and raped, and she goes from house to house. It's almost like a Alice in Wonderland, where she's just traveling around where these different things are happening to her, but everywhere she goes she keeps getting treated badly by everyone. And the lesson is, I guess, like, women shouldn't want sex. And then at the end she wakes up and it was all a dream. And I think the way uh feminists view it is the fact that she wanted sex is why it happened. And then when she wakes up from the dream, everything plays out the way it did in the dream, like it's happening all over again, because again, she wanted sex from her husband. So women and their desire for sex does play a part, consciously or subconsciously, in roughies. And it does seem that women do get punished for wanting sex and sexual gratification. But yeah, Bad Girls Go to Hell was a pretty dark movie as well. Another good one. There's actually another good line in that. You mentioned a few really good lines in this. You're right, that ending where he's like, is, was my brother's life. That's a great way to end it. But
Yeah.
in Bad Girls Go to Hell, there was another good line too, where one of the adventures, or one of the misadventures that the main actress lead character goes on, is one of the people she stays with is a woman, and the woman is a lesbian and loves her, and she's like, I love you, and she's like, I love you too, that's why I have to leave. And again, it's kind of a deep line. If it was
Hmm.
fleshed out, it says something about society, or religion, and like how people feel about homosexuality. There could be a lot to develop there. But that's the
Hmm.
issue with Wishman. She shows you these sparks, but either she does not execute it, she doesn't have the patience to execute it. It's just about, hey, a good title, a good poster, a good trailer, and make my money back. You
Hmm.
don't know what's going on in her mind, but based on her interviews, there wasn't a lot going on as trying to really accomplish anything beyond getting her money back.
Yeah. Well, I suppose what you could say about a movie like this is it has ideas in it that make sense, but they're not quite developed right. There's kind of a series of what we might call unearned moments, like where she goes to the kitchen and is like, wow, he's really interesting. He's more exciting. And it's like, but he hasn't said or done anything that would make you say that, like you need to write the scene that kind of makes her think that, you've got to earn that moment. But it's more, she
Show don't
just,
tell, as they say.
yeah, she just sort of knows that, okay, this is what I need to have happen. She needs to become interested in this guy, you know, but there's nothing there to kind of show why she would be interested in this guy. It's not quite properly written in that way, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, yeah. I trust me, I know. I've seen a lot of films. I know. As far as recommending this film, I don't know if I can because it is a tough watch. But I'd say, I mean, I find her movies endearing, and I wanted to do this review, and overall, I'm glad we did it.
Mhm.
But I don't know how much a modern moviegoer would get out of this because the sex and titillation, you're right, 24 minutes into the movie before, which is essentially halfway through the movie in a way, before you
Mhm.
see nudity. I mean, you're not going to be watching these movies for titillation anyway, because these are like, by today's beauty standards, these aren't necessarily women that are like you're dying to see naked anyway. I mean, they're decent looking women, but they're not, you know, silver screen type women. They're not like models or tens or anything like that. They're kind of like everyday average looking women. They're not fantasy girls, and average bodies, and waiting 30 minutes to see some breasts. I don't think that is really going to interest a lot of people in today's day and age. And to see like a middle-aged man just laying on top of some model like lifelessly, while dialogue spews about how passionate it is. I don't know if that's grabbing a bunch of people. And all of this just to see maybe about 5 minutes of like some really good scenes. I don't know if that's going to appeal to anyone, like any younger viewers, but if you're, a film buff, then, I think it's a good watch. And for someone like myself, I love her films.
Yeah. Well, I think it's certainly not going to appeal to everyone. And you're right. I always think about this review I read back in the 80s, which was of a teen sex comedy that had come out. And the reviewer said that when he was young, he went to see an adult film, and he was only 17, so he had to lie, he had to use fake ID to get in to see this adult film. And he said the film just had nothing in it really, and then at the last minute some woman took her top off and she had a bra on, and that was it. Like, that was how adult this movie was. And here in the 80s, there's this comedy that isn't even restricted, and there's like full frontal nudity in it, and he was just kind of shocked and scandalized by that, because what used to be an adult film, just had nothing on this mainstream comedy film. And so, yeah, I think audiences today will be puzzled to think that this was essentially an adult film of the day, right? This was the kind of film you would have gone to a special theater to see, and you'd have to be 18. Um, and yeah, it's like, yeah, there's some nudity, but it's pretty tasteful, really, by today's standards. It's not going to be, yeah, it's not going to resemble what we think of as porn, that's for sure. But I think the reasons to watch it are the campiness, the moments that make you laugh, and I did laugh several times throughout this movie. And it does have kind of a retro charm, I think, and almost a retro uh, eroticism, I suppose you could say, where the black and white photography. I don't know. There's something about it. It just, I think, as a vintage experience, I think it will work for some people, but it won't work for everyone. And some people will not even watch it because it's in black and white. They refuse to see anything in black and white, which I think is ridiculous. But for those who like old movies and weird movies, I think this one is worth a look, and certainly some of Doris Wishman's other films are definitely worth a look.
You said three facts. It's black and white, it's old, and it's weird. Everything else is subjective.
That's right. That's why it's a review, I guess. It's a subjective opinion. But yeah, it's old, it's black and white, and it's weird. Definitely.
It's something weird.
Indeed it is. Indeed it is.